My name is Yoav Litvin. I'm a board member at the Whatcom Peace and Justice Center. For those unfamiliar with the WPJC, we are a storefront center on Bay Street in Bellingham. We do community outreach. We're a hub. We are a resource center, a library. We have several programs. We have an alternative for military service program, which is a person by the name of Anissa runs it, and she is situated in Bellingham High Schools, providing alternatives for our high schoolers who are seduced by the military with donuts and video games to join the military. So I feel like that's a very important mission that we have. We also provide different resources like peacekeeping vests, educational materials. We host events like these. And we provide kind of a hub for different groups who are interested in building their networks. So I encourage you to visit our website for everything. Everything's there. I forgot a lot, and there is a lot to talk about. It's whatcompjc.org, and there's a peace calendar there for those of us who have troubles with events and remembering when all these things are. All of the events are in the peace calendar. Just link up to it, and then you can see the events in the area. I highly recommend. That's what I do. So yes, now that we're done with that, welcome to this very important event with these three distinguished speakers. First, we have Joshua Frank here, who is an award-winning journalist and the managing editorial director of Counterpunch, a leading online political magazine, which I've had the privilege of publishing in for around a decade. Josh is based in California. He's the author of Atomic Days, The Untold Story of the Most Toxic Place in America, which is a groundbreaking expose on the catastrophic legacy of nuclear waste, with a focus on Hanford here in Washington State. His forthcoming book delves into the green energy revolution, offering critical insights into sustainable alternatives to atomic power. Next, we are privileged to have Ray Atchison, the director of Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the world's oldest feminist peace organization. A longtime advocate for disarmament, Ray served on the steering group of the Nobel Peace Prize-winning international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. They are a leading voice at the United Nations and beyond, working tirelessly to dismantle systems of violence from nuclear weapons to the carceral state. Ray is the author of Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy, and Abolishing State Violence, A World Beyond Bombs, Borders, and Cages. Finally, we are honored to have M.V. Ramana, the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security, and a professor at the University of British Columbia's School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. An internationally recognized expert on nuclear energy and disarmament, Ramana's forthcoming book, Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change, critiques the role of atomic power in addressing the climate crisis. The catastrophic fires in LA further emphasize the importance and relevance of his work. He is also the author of The Power of Promise, Examining Nuclear Energy in India, and a co-editor of Prisoners of the Nuclear Dream, a recipient of the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship and Leo Szilard Award. Ramana is a member of several influential global panels on nuclear risk and security. Please join me in welcoming these prestigious speakers.
We all live in a world of extremes. I just came up from Los Angeles. We just had a very extreme event happen, which I know you're all aware of. We have some extreme politicians. We have one that's going to be coming into power on Monday. And we all are living with the lingering threat of extreme disasters. And, well, many of these extremes are unprecedented in human history. They aren't necessarily unexpected, right? And I'm thinking about the LA fires, for instance. But I'm thinking about a lot of other things as well. And climate change is an existential threat that we all are linked to. and exposed to and at risk of in one way or another, no matter where we live on this planet. And I think we need to think about atomic weapons in the same framework. Someone recently asked me, well, what do you think is more of a threat? Climate change or atomic weapons? And I said, well, climate change is coming. It's here, and it could get us. But for the last 50 years, we've had enough nuclear weapons on this planet to explode it about 10 times over, right? So this threat is escalating, and it hasn't gone away despite the tremendous work of folks like Ray and Ramana. I think about these extremes in the context of one place that I think exemplifies how history is linked, that history in many ways is linear. And I focused on a project on Hanford, the nuclear reservation that's in eastern Washington state. For those of you that don't know what Hanford is, I know a lot of you do and are probably a lot more educated on it than I am even. Hanford was one of the locations chosen for the Manhattan Project, along with Oak Ridge and Los Alamos. For those of you that maybe saw the blockbuster Oppenheimer film that I have a lot of criticism of, I know we all do here, one of the things they left out was what was happening at some of the other facilities. They focused on exploding the bombs in the desert of Nevada, or New Mexico rather, but didn't talk about where some of that fuel for that bomb was made. That was made at Hanford in a facility called the B reactor. Plutonium produced in the B reactor was also used in the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. For about 4 decades, Hanford was the conveyor belt of plutonium production for the U.S. nuclear arsenal during the Cold War. It was a project that polluted the landscape unlike any before it came along. And a little bit about the area of Hanford. If you all live in Washington State, I don't know if you make it across the Cascades, but it's a much different landscape in eastern Washington, right? It's more barren. It is along the Columbia River. It's an agricultural community. When the administrators came along, the reason they picked Hanford was because it was a rural place. It wasn't next to a population center like Seattle. It was kind of out of sight, out of mind. Of course, people lived on the Hanford Reservation, the Yakima and the Umatilla, as well as farmers that were removed to create this atomic beast that was created under secret of the Manhattan Project. And many people that worked on the Hanford Project didn't even know what other people working on it, even if they were their neighbors that lived in this little makeshift town of Richland, didn't know what their workers next door even were doing. Many didn't even know exactly what was happening at Hanford. Well, fast forward until the end of the 80s, at the end of the Cold War, Hanford stopped producing plutonium. But during that time, there was 9 reactors that were built. And you have to imagine what it was like in the 70s and 80s when we had this arms race with the Soviet Union. The U.S. was producing plutonium at such a pace that they had nowhere to put the waste from these production facilities. So they came up with this brilliant scheme. Let's put it in these big underground containers, these hulking cylinders made of metal. 155 of them are single-shelled, and I think there's another 21 or so that are double-shelled. Well, the single-shelled ones would become full. They'd have to put it in the next one and the next one. Well, they created quite a problem for themselves, and I document a lot of this in the book that I wrote, that even the early administrators knew that this was only a temporary solution for a problem that had no long-term solution. So we're sitting here today, and I like to think of Hanford as still this place where the Cold War is bubbling. There are 55 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste sitting in these underground containers. 3 of them right now are leaking into the groundwater supply that is making its way to the Columbia River. There have been many, many more leaks throughout its history, something like 60 some documented leaks. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next decade or so, maybe in the next month or so, we're going to hear about another leak happening. This is how dangerous this stuff is. And to think about the lifespan of the contents in these containers, you're talking about materials that will last hundreds of thousands of years, can forever change this whole Pacific Northwest. So that's one danger that our production of weapons produced. There's another one that's happening out there with these tanks as well, which is that some of them are producing hydrogen. Well, they have to literally off-gas these tanks, because if there's a spark or something ignites them, you could have an explosion that could become sort of a domino effect, and other tanks explode as well. And I don't even want to, think about what that would do to this entire region, not only just in and around Richland, but the greater Northwest. I believe that it would completely decimate this economy. It would pollute so much of the interior West. And a lot of you may have lived here when Mount St. Helens erupted. Now imagine if Mount St. Helens was full of radioactive waste. I mean, you think about how far that ash had spread. I mean, some of the fires that were happening in Oregon, what was it, 5-6 years ago now, was making its way all the way to Washington, D.C. Some of this stuff would travel far and wide. I believe that Spokane and some of these cities would become uninhabitable. Now, that's scary, right? All of this is very scary. And I think we should be scared. I think we should be scared of what this type of stuff poses to the future, not only to us today, but to people and animals and biodiversity in the years to come. Now, what are they doing about it? Hanford is managed by the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy oversees these projects, but they aren't the main employer out there. Bechtel and other companies are employed by the Department of Energy to carry out this work. So, of course, they know the contents of these containers, which, by the way, the ones that are leaking, their answer to them is to put tarps over top of them to stop the rain from literally falling into the tanks or pushing that groundwater or pushing that radioactive waste further into the groundwater supply. So they know this stuff is bad. They know what's going on, and they have a solution, which is to take the contents out of these containers and vitrify it, which is to turn it into glass. Well, as you can imagine, that's not very easy. It's not like filling up an ice tray and putting it into the freezer. It's a lot more complicated than that. Back when Hanford shut down in the late 80s, they came along and said, well, we'll probably have this stuff cleaned up in about a decade. Well, fast forward now, however long later, I'm bad with math, but what's this, 40 years later? They've spent $600 billion in some, $100 billion have been spent. They have an estimate for $600 billion to get this stuff remediated and pulled out of these tanks. The way that it's going, I don't think that we're likely to see that happen anytime soon. And I think by the end of the decade, that bill could reach $1 trillion. So not only is Hanford the most toxic place in the Western Hemisphere, it also is the most expensive environmental cleanup in world history. So I think because of those two facts alone, and the complexity of the work being done out there by a lot of really good people, but it's captured within a for-profit cleanup. And I would argue that creates an immense problem. It creates a problem because those that are working on remediating it are doing so for profit. And I think history of Hanford and what's happened at the site bears that out. I write about a couple whistleblowers that talk about this and in better detail than I can explain to you. But the end story is really, really scary. And I think we all should be concerned because we're taxpayers. And just so I don't come across as a super alarmist, an accident at a similar facility has happened in 1957 at a site in the Soviet Union called Mayak, which was essentially a sister facility to Hanford. It was creating plutonium for the Soviets' nuclear arsenal. had an accident. It was, by radiation release, the third largest accident in world history, and a lot of us don't know about it. And why don't we know about it? It's because I would argue, well, not only was it secret for a long time, and the CIA knew about it but didn't want to talk about it, because if we knew about the risks that these things pose, we would be opposed to more proliferation as well as nuclear power, which we'll get into people that are much more knowledgeable than me on that topic. But MIAC was horrific. It decimated some 60 square miles. Two entire villages had to be evacuated. I write about MIAC and what was witnessed on the ground, and it's truly horrifying. What happened? It's equally as horrifying as Chernobyl, but it wasn't a power facility, energy facility. They were creating plutonium, exactly the same way that Hanford was creating plutonium. So there's precedent for this, and I think it's really important that we understand these risks, because as we're talking about solutions to extreme problems like climate change, there is an argument being made by the boosters of atomic energy that this should be rolled out as a solution to climate change, that atomic energy is efficient, it's safer than it's ever been, and we can roll it out quickly and get this thing taken care of. But all of that is not true, which we can get into in a little bit. But they're trying to do that here in the Northwest. They're trying to do this along the Columbia River. They're trying to do it at Hanford. And it's amazing to me to think that we could be in a situation to create more waste when we haven't even come up with a solution for the waste that already exists. I live not too far from the San Onofre nuclear facility in Southern California, where there is enormous millions of gallons of radioactive waste sitting on an eroding bluff above the ocean in a seismic area. I mean, we don't have a solution for what to do with this stuff in a facility that's shut down. I mean, San Onofre is no longer producing producing energy. Diablo Canyon is up and running and producing waste right now under the guise of, clean energy, which it's not. So there's a lot to be said, and I really thank everybody coming out and to hear what we have to say about this and to talk about it, and I hope we can have an engaging conversation. But right in our own backyard here in Washington State is a problem that is linked to our obsession with weapons, as well as our misunderstanding of the threats that waste poses to the ecology and to future generations. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Josh. I think one of the important things to hold from what Josh was talking about in terms of Hanford is that that's one story about one site in one country, right? Every single nuclear site in the world has a similar story, a story of toxic contamination, a story of accidents, a story of legacy of harm to local communities and to the land and to people and animals living in the vicinity for many generations into the future from now. And so I think that when we're looking at the scope of the challenges posed by both nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, it's really important to recognize that it's not just one or two places in the world and that have these problems. It's actually all over, in particular in the nine countries that possess nuclear weapons, but of course also in those that use nuclear energy or that provide the uranium that's used in either nuclear weapons or nuclear energy, or the sites being looked at for radioactive waste storage, and all of the other elements of the production of the atomic industry. So again, as well as Hanford being right in the backyard, there's also the largest concentration of deployed nuclear weapons in the world in Washington. So at the Bangor Naval Base, there are 8 nuclear submarines. Each of those submarines contains 20 missiles. Each of those missiles has 4 to 5 nuclear warheads on it. And these are deployed at any given time around the world globally, but it actually makes Washington state, if it were its own country, it would make it the third largest nuclear armed state in the world. That's how many nuclear weapons are here. And so, of course, all of the problems with Hanford in terms of accidents and leaks are a risk here. It also makes Washington, of course, a target in terms of nuclear war planning for the world as well. So all of these challenges are very local and very global. And it's, it's so unfathomable in some ways, but of course the reason that these problems persist is because of the profit that can be made off of them. And it is a very limited number of people in the world profiting from the creation of weapons of mass destruction and the wielding of these weapons, just the same as it is a minority of people profiting from every other social ill that we have in this world. And so there's about $83 billion spent every year on nuclear weapons. That figure goes up every year. I know that funding for nuclear weapons and the global stockpile of nuclear weapons has, of course, did come down at the end of the Cold War. So there was between 70 and 80,000 nuclear weapons during the height of the Cold War. And now there's a little over 12,000 nuclear weapons. But what we're seeing now is that in all 9 states that possess them, there is actually an increase in funding, and there's what they call euphemistically modernization. But we are in a new nuclear arms race. They just call it modernization so that people don't get upset about the arms race and reflect back on what that looked like in the 1980s. And there are a handful of companies that make extraordinary profits from this. And one of these companies, also local to Washington, is Boeing. It's one of the main producers of nuclear weapons in the United States. And so these companies, of course, have undue influence over government policy, and then, of course, there's the lobbyists and the think tanks, and the sort of reinforcement of the messages about we have to have nuclear weapons for deterrence, and there's geopolitical uncertainty, and these are our the only thing keeping us safe from a war with Russia or whoever the big bad of the moment might be. And so it's a great example of state capture, similar to fossil fuel industry and other industries that have such control over government policy. I wanted to give 2 concrete examples of the new nuclear arms race, just to make it a little bit more visceral. So one of the elements of the modernization program, as it's called, is the Sentinel missile program. So they are actively replacing all of the United States intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. So that's about 400 new missiles across 5 states in the US. So that's Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, and North Dakota. So these are the missiles, the US land-based missiles that are stored in the silos that are underground. And what's really shocking about US policy around these land-based missiles is that they are intended to be the main target for an enemy nuclear strike. And the US government itself, the language they use for these sites is the nuclear sponge. And the idea is that, for example, Russia would direct most of its weapons towards these missile silos in order to take out the US capacity to respond. And the expectation is that this would be a sacrifice zone. And what recent studies have really dug into is what would that look like if that were to actually happen. They have found that there would be millions of fatalities, there would be contamination of most of the United States and Canada and northern Mexico. And the radiation and the other impacts would, of course, last for a very, very long time. And so this is sort of just a thing that is so widely not known or discussed in the United States at this time, that this is the actual government policy to allow this to happen. That's the intention of having those ICBMs where they are. The concept of sacrifice zone is really important, I think, when we're talking about nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Another great example is Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory. And so Josh mentioned Oppenheimer, and the story that was told is not necessarily an accurate story of the land and the people that lived in Los Alamos, in the area around Los Alamos at the time, or the area where the bomb was tested, where the Trinity test was conducted as well, that was portrayed in the film as empty land, which was not at all the case. And many people are still suffering the impacts of that Trinity test out in the desert. But Los Alamos today is actively being expanded. And I talked to a lot of people who assume that it existed during the Manhattan Project and was closed, but in fact it has continued to operate to this day and is now expanding rapidly. It is being commissioned to build all new plutonium pits for the missiles, these new missiles that I just described. And so plutonium from sites like Hanford and elsewhere being made into new cores. So they're going to swap out all of the cores of nuclear weapons and put new cores into them. So all this work is being done right now at Los Alamos. And the impact that this is having, not just on the usual risks around the production of nuclear weapons, but also the expansion of the lab has created a situation of mass inequality in New Mexico. So Los Alamos is one of the United States' richest counties in the entire country. And New Mexico is one of the poorest states in the United States. And it has incredible inequalities. So there are a lot of millionaires that live in and work at Los Alamos. But outside, there's high rates of drug use, of maternal mortality, of suicide, of drunk driving, most of the social metrics by which they measure states. New Mexico is in the bottom of the list. And so it's creating even more economic inequality within the region where Los Alamos is based. Most of the workforce there, they have degrees in physics and chemistry, and then rely on the poor communities surrounding Los Alamos to provide the services. So we're seeing what was already economically stratified area becoming worse and worse with this expansion. And so I think what's important when we're talking about these sites or these modernization programs or any other element of the nuclear complex is really also that this has a direct relationship to everything else that's happening in this country and everything else that's happening in this world in terms of economic priorities, what crises are we solving and what crises are we creating, and where is our money going, of course. And I think wherever we can find not just the sort of abstract connections, but the real structural connections between our struggles is very important. So one thing that I talk about a lot, especially over the last year and a half or 2 years, has been that many of the same companies who manufacture nuclear weapons are the same companies that are making the bombs and the fighter jets that are being sent to Israel, right? So these are the same people, the same CEOs are making profits both off nuclear bombs and off of genocide. And so I think, the ways, these threads that we can pull on together to find positions from which we can challenge these structures and systems is very, very important. And so I never like to just talk about the problems. I always like to talk about solutions too. And so I do want to give some hope, which is we do have a treaty, a global treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons, adopted in 2017 at the United Nations. The 9 nuclear armed states are not party to this treaty, but it is a tool that we have been able to use for divestment, for example. So going to financial institutions saying nuclear weapons are illegal from this treaty, and we are seeing more and more financial institutions divest. And so what are the ways that we can connect that up with the BDS movement? What are the ways that we can connect that up with fossil fuel divestment? So that's sort of where I'm trying to orient myself in my own activism and encouraging other people to do. And also, I love going to new places and learning from folks of what's the local struggle and how does our work globally against nuclear weapons connect up to whatever you're confronting in your local situation. And here it happens to also be nuclear weapons, along with many other things. So thanks very much.
Between Josh and Ray, they have laid out very clearly one of the core principles that how our society is organized today, where they talked about how there are so many risks that are socialized, that fall upon society, and while the profits flow to private corporations, right? And this is something which we see, once you realize that this is how the world is operating today, the United States, Canada, all of these places, you will see this in so many other areas as well. So it's not just about nuclear weapons or nuclear energy or any of these things. And this, in a way, is also the story of nuclear energy, right? I'll say a little bit about that, and partly because we see this media constantly telling us that the solution to climate change is nuclear energy, or it could be something else. More recently, it has been about the growth of artificial intelligence and data centers needing huge amounts of electricity, and nuclear is going to be the solution, right? Here it is Amazon that's talking about it, and Microsoft as well. Further down south, it's Google and Facebook, rather Meta. So these are when you hear that narrative, you have to try to understand why is it that they are sort of saying these things. And to understand that, I'll go back a little bit in history, just a little bit back, not all the way back, to say that this latest round of hype about nuclear energy is something that most of us here would have actually seen in the past also. If you just think back to the first decade of the century. So under the George Bush administration, there was a big push to expand nuclear energy. And in 2005, President Bush passed something called the Energy Policy Act that put in place a lot of incentives for electricity utility companies around the country to invest in nuclear energy. And that promise used to be called the Nuclear Renaissance. And it was supposedly based on new nuclear reactor designs that are going to solve all the problems of the old designs. Right? And all that talk about how these are going to be cheap and they're going to be quickly built and so on led to about 30 reactor projects being planned around the country. Okay? Of these, around 15 of them were supposed to come online by 2021. That was the prediction according to in that time period. Come forward by about a decade, of the 30 reactor projects, exactly 4 of them go forward. Construction starts. These were in the states of Georgia and South Carolina. And the rest of them basically balked at the price tag of these nuclear reactors. In South Carolina and Georgia, these construction projects moved forward, and I'll explain in a second why they moved forward there and not in other places. But just to tell the rest of that story, of those 4 reactor projects, the 2 that were being built in South Carolina, they were canceled after about $9 billion was spent. And that cost is still running up, because when these companies borrow money, they are forced to keep paying back the loans and the debt on the loan, even after the construction project has been completely canceled. Okay? So that price tag is constantly going up. It's only in the state of Georgia that of the 30-odd reactors that were planned, 2 of them were constructed. Right? and this is in a place, is a project called Vogel. And the Vogel project cost, the current estimate is around $36 billion. Right? And that $36 billion is up from a cost estimate of $14 billion when construction started in 2014 or 2013. And that $14 billion, again, is not the right figure to compare it with, because when the Bush administration passed the Energy Policy Act, they were doing so on the basis of cost estimates from Westinghouse Corporation, one of the companies that profits a lot from nuclear power, as well as the other people who are promoting nuclear power, when they were saying that these two reactors could be built for about $5 to $6 billion. So that $5 to $6 billion went up to $14 billion, which went up to $36 billion in the case of Georgia. Now, why did Georgia and South Carolina go ahead with these projects? Was because the legislatures there passed legislations which allowed these utility companies to pass on the cost of building these reactors to the ratepayers in those states, right? Well before the construction actually ended, was finished, right? So the people in South Carolina paid several $1 billion, we don't know exactly how much it is, because it's still being fought over, for a project that was canceled, from which they would never get any electricity, all right? And that's the process by which these projects actually move forward. So they have to find a way to pass the costs on to the public. And that's the only time when they are actually doing. And this explains also one thing which puzzles a lot of people, which is to say, everybody knows that nuclear plants are expensive, all right? If you know anything about nuclear plants, you know that they are expensive. You know that once in a while they can go bang and produce a lot of radioactive stuff that goes out. You know that they produce these radioactive waste, which we don't have a solution for. These are all sort of things that we know from common sense, right? From having just read the news and so on and so forth. And so you have to sort of ask, why is it that corporations, which are supposed to be interested in their bottom line, in profits, why do they build these plants? And the answer is because they can do that only when they pass on all the cost to the public, either through their electricity bills or through their taxes. And so then the next question you can be asking yourself is also, why is it that these governments, whether it's the United States or whether it's Canada, all of them, why do they promote this source of energy which we know to be so problematic, right? And there are multiple reasons for this, and I can have a long discussion about that, but I will come back to one particular connection, which is that to do with nuclear weapons. Right? Nuclear energy and nuclear weapons are tightly bound together. You cannot have one without the other. And there are, broadly speaking, 5 different connections. Both Josh and Ray have sort of talked about one connection, which is a historical connection. So the first nuclear reactors that were built around the world, including the United States, were built to make nuclear weapons or materials for nuclear weapons, plutonium in particular. And in many other countries as well, their first reactors were built based on these same designs that were used to produce material for nuclear weapons. So there's a historical connection. And then the second and sort of the more, then the reason why there's this historical connection is that both nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, the production of nuclear energy, require certain materials which are rare. Okay? So one is a material called enriched uranium. So it's uranium as is found in nature, has 2 different isotopes, one called uranium-238 and one called uranium-235. In nature, it's mostly uranium-238, but in order for using that in a nuclear reactor, at least the designs that are used in the United States, the uranium-235 component has to be increased in concentration. And that is done in so-called enrichment facilities using these machines called centrifuges these days, which are sort of like washing machines. Okay? And the centrifuges, when you operate them, you can operate them to enrich the uranium to the extent that you need it for a nuclear reactor, or you can keep operating it and continuing to enrich it when you can make it into material that can be used in nuclear weapons. And this is the reason why people are concerned about Iran's nuclear program. Iran's government says we don't have a nuclear weapons program. We are only interested in peaceful nuclear energy. But they have this uranium enrichment technology. They have been making more and more enriched uranium of higher and higher enrichment levels. And everybody knows that once they keep doing that, at some point they will have enough material to make nuclear weapons. And then it becomes just a matter of intention, not capability, right? So it's a question of choice when they want to make it or not. And this is the same capability and intention relationship that exists in all countries. And if you look around the world, the countries that have, and this is the third connection, and sorry, I should also say, there's another material that can be used to make both nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, and that's plutonium. Okay? So plutonium is the material that was produced, that Josh mentioned, was produced in Hanford, and that was used in the first test that happened in Trinity, and the bomb that was dropped in Nagasaki. All nuclear reactors will necessarily produce plutonium. That is just a law of physics, that some of the neutrons that are being produced are going to go on, be absorbed by uranium to make into plutonium. And so these two materials are common to both nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, and that's a very important connection. A third connection is a geographical one. If you look around the world, there are roughly around 400 odd nuclear reactors operating, give or take. At any given point, some of them will be shut down, so I don't want to give an exact number. But of these, the majority of them are in the countries that have nuclear weapons. So United States, Russia, China, the UK, France, India, Pakistan. There are only two countries which have nuclear weapons, which don't have nuclear power plants, and those are Israel and North Korea. And if you include in this all of the countries like Canada, which are in military alliances with countries with nuclear weapon states, then the overlap is overwhelming, right? So there's a huge overlap between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. Just by looking at the map, you can sort of see that connection. So that's a third connection. A fourth connection is of the kind of training that a country would have to invest in, so that people can design and operate nuclear power plants. And the kind of training that is required for them has a lot of overlap with the kind of training that is required for somebody to make nuclear weapons as well. So if a country wants to eventually develop nuclear weapons, one way by which they can develop the requisite personnel, the capacity among people to do the work, is to say we're going to set up a nuclear power program. And you train the people in nuclear physics and metallurgy and certain kinds of engineering and so on. And then at some point, these people can then go on to say, okay, now we're going to make nuclear weapons. Okay? And we've seen this happen in the case of Pakistan, which was a country which did not have a lot of capability to make nuclear anything. And when it was first became a free country in 1947, and then a whole bunch of Pakistani engineers and scientists came to the United States as part of the Atoms for Peace program under President Eisenhower, and then they went back, and then they eventually set up the nuclear weapons program that operated there. Same thing is the story with Iran. Same thing might become the story with Saudi Arabia today. Okay? So there's that connection of people. And last but not least, there's an overlap in the kind of institutions that manage nuclear weapons, that profit from nuclear weapons. So both Ray and Josh mentioned the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy oversees both nuclear weapons and promotes nuclear energy in the United States. The same thing is true in India with the Department of Atomic Energy that does both of that. And likewise, there are a number of corporations that I sort of list in my book which profit both from nuclear weapons and from nuclear energy, and also from making military weapons in general. Okay? So these are sort of the connections which make it give governments a reason to invest in nuclear energy despite all of the problems with nuclear energy. Right? Climate change and trying to deal with climate change is just a smokescreen for doing this something else going on there. Right? Some of them might genuinely believe in it, and that I think has to do also with a set of arguments that come up, which are made often by people who want to promote nuclear energy. And that argument is simple. So if today we talk about trying to deal with climate change, I mean, Ray was generous enough to sort of end us with a note about a solution. I usually end up depressing people a lot, but I will try my little bit to try and say, one thing which we do know, one of the only good science we have in terms of thinking about climate change has been the enormous reduction in the cost of renewable sources of energy, in particular solar and wind energy. The costs of those have plummeted a lot. They have become much more prevalent around the world. Between, let's say, if you take some arbitrary date, let's say 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, at that time, about less than 1% of the globe's electricity, the world's electricity, used to come from renewables. I think in 2023, which is the last year for which we have data, that figure was a little bit over 15%. Okay? So it's still a long way to go, but from 1 to 15% is a lot. Just FYI, during the same time period between the late 90s and 2023, nuclear energy came down by about half. It used to be about 17.5%. It was just over 9% as of 2023. So the trends are quite opposite. So renewables are something which we can see as a potential solution, but there are two buts. Okay. One is that the argument that you will see a lot in media, especially by people who are promoting nuclear energy, but also not just by them, is the argument that we cannot rely on solar and wind energy because the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time, and you all heard this, I'm sure. Now, that is true and not true. I mean, the sun really doesn't shine all the time. We know that. The wind doesn't blow all the time. That also we know. But that does not mean that we cannot run a reliable electricity system on the basis of these. Okay? It doesn't rain all the time. Does not mean that I don't have water here, right? So there are the way you deal with that kind of variable source of energy is to plan for it. How do you plan for it? You plan for the three broad buckets of solutions. One is to think about what we call diversity. So you don't only build solar panels, you don't only have wind turbines, you don't only have dams, you have multiple different things. And the hope is that when the wind is not blowing in Washington, maybe it is blowing in Idaho. And if the two grids are connected, you can pass some of the electricity back and forth. The second possible way to deal with it is through the use of storage devices, batteries in particular, but also other forms of storage. And then the third way by which you can deal with it is by modifying the demand part of it, right? So you do not have to necessarily use let's say, charging your car. If you have an electric car, it doesn't have to be charged on the moment. You can wait for when there is a lot of renewable energy in the grid and less demand. And so that kind of variability of demand can be one other way to deal with the variability of the supply of electricity. But I don't want to make this sound to be too easy, because I think there is also a problem, which is that while we can use renewable energy is not like a panacea. It's not like everything is going to be solved. It has its own set of environmental impacts. It has its own costs. There are its sacrifice zones that are created to produce materials for that, either for lithium or a whole bunch of other materials. And it also is not something which you can keep expanding all along, right? Because we do live on a finite planet. And we are using a system, an economic system, that is based on continuous growth. And on a finite planet, you cannot keep growing forever, right? So if, for example, and we are seeing an example of that right now, which is happening, which is all of this talk about AI and data centers and so on requiring electricity, right? If that demand grows very rapidly, you cannot set up solar panels fast enough to meet that growth in demand, right? Now, that demand growth is probably hyped, It probably will not actually materialize because I don't see how there's possibly a business model for that. It's a separate story. I don't want to get into that. I also have huge problems with what is being used, what these data centers are doing. Most of the time what they are doing is to steal our data and store it there, or they are using it to aid, war making and genocides, and all kinds of really horrible things. So we should be rightfully asking the question, do we really need all of these things, right? And that's a larger question which often doesn't get talked about, because when you talk about solutions, you want to hear this thinking, oh, we can leave everything as it is and yet solve this one problem. I think that's not possible. But at the same time, we have to also come back to saying we have to have systemic change, and systemic change is possible without just only technical solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. We'll open the floor for questions. I had a question actually to start it off for you, Josh. About 8 years ago, I think, I heard on the radio that one of the lids on Hanford blew off. I didn't know anything. I called my wife. I said, pack your bags. My point being, what do we know about pack your bags? What do we know about that moment of when should we actually be scared? Because it turned out to be nothing as far as our day-to-day lives. So how do we know when something is serious? What about our foods? Are they contaminated from these chemicals going into the Columbia River? Oh, but after that, if you could just stand up in place and ask your question, the panel will call on you, and you don't need to worry about the mic, okay?
Well, I wish that I had a clear and concise answer to that question. I think that we won't know until it's too late. I think very much an apropos example is actually what happened in LA a couple weeks ago. I mean, we knew that fire risks are very high in certain areas. We know that we had a lot of rain last spring that created all of this growth. Then we haven't had rain for 8 months. We had all this kindling. We knew the Santa Ana's blow. But we had no idea that it was going to hit us at that extent, and there's a lot of finger pointing going on and this and that. I bring that up only because I do think that the risks at Hanford are even more dire in many ways. And I think that the Department of Energy and the contractors have an incentive not to be transparent about the risks and about what they don't know. And I think that's a problem. And there are some really good organizations working on these issues. The Yakama Nation, Columbia Riverkeeper, there's other groups that are doing really good work. But it's much like the Pentagon is captured, the Department of Energy is captured. And to break through those walls of bureaucracy and transparency is very, very difficult. And you have to understand that Hanford was running as a secretive site for decades. It still has a military apparatus component to it because, as Ray mentioned, it could be a target of an attack one day. So there's a lot of reasons why entrance and transparency has not been present, and so that's a really big problem. And we don't know those risks. I have done FOIA requests to try to figure out, because I'm certain that studies have been done to show what an accident may look like and what it might impact. But local municipalities, fire departments, they don't actually have a lot of this information. And then it goes, I think, to the larger conversation about this technology, which consistently is promoted as safe, secure, that these accidents are one-offs. Bill Gates infamously said, and Bill Gates is funding one of these reactors, a small modular reactor in Wyoming, said, well, if you ignore Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, everything's been pretty good. Well, it's hard to ignore those things, right? And we're still dealing with them. But I think that's just sort of the blinders that these not only the corporations but the government has when looking at these technologies, because there's too many reasons to support it and not enough to oppose it. And so I think Hanford falls into that. Because largely, Hanford still is located where it's located in eastern Washington, a very rural area, and the towns around it are largely dependent on Hanford, Richland in particular, for the economy. So the risks are very much real for the people that live in that town, but much like the people that work in the weapons manufacturing or energy, it's your bread and butter, right? And so there's a lot of problems. That was a long way of saying I have no idea. Other than there's a lot of different possibilities. The worst case scenario, one that I outlined with an explosion, but as we can talk about a little bit, the potential for long-term impacts on groundwater supplies, on biodiversity, these are things that are going to be impacting generations ahead of us. And that's when I think about history as being linear. The decisions we make today will impact future generations. And nothing more so than the nuclear technologies, because this stuff stays around for hundreds of thousands of years. So we can talk a lot about that, and hopefully there'll be some questions.
If you're thinking about the impacts of an actual event that happens, there are two kinds of things to think about. One is, where exactly does the radiation go? And that is going to be a function of the wind and the rains. And that changes all the time. Okay? And we saw this, for example, in the case of the Fukushima accident in Japan in 2011, when we were very lucky, because for much of the time when those nuclear plants were spewing out huge amounts of radioactive materials, the wind was blowing into the ocean. Okay? The fish were not so lucky, but the people who lived in Japan were. But the worst case scenario there was something that was laid out, was presented to the Prime Minister of Japan at that time, Naoto Kan, saying that if this and this and this happens, a particular fire happens and the wind is blowing towards Tokyo, you might have to evacuate Tokyo. And Tokyo has, 20 million people, whatever it is. It was his nightmare scenario, right? And that made him decide that he would never support nuclear energy afterwards. And that's, I think, the kind of scenario that can be happening. And the next question then is, how does one prepare for that unlikely but possible scenario, right? How does a township prepare? How does a region prepare when the whole enterprise is built on the idea that this is never going to happen, right? So that's the contradiction there. Because if you want to promote this technology, Hanford is Hanford, it is there. But when it comes to newer nuclear plants, so this site in Wyoming, for example, the TerraPower, the company that Bill Gates funds, goes around saying, oh, there is no risk of accident. We have thought about everything, as though they are so super smart, they're so smug about it that they know everything that can possibly happen. And so then what is the confidence that it's going to give the local authorities, and what are they going to be planning for? They're going to say, well, this is never going to happen. Why should we waste time doing drills? Why should we waste, scare people? People might not buy houses here because of this possibility, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of incentive to try and live in denial.
Hi, I'd like to make a couple comments. First of all, I so much appreciated all three of your presentations. It's excellent. And I've gone to some, really appreciate your work. So there's two additional things I'd like to point out that concern me a lot, and I think you can even add these in some of your talks. One of them is the corrosion. There's 177 tanks, they're steel. I worked in the refinery environment for many, many years. Steel corrodes. All steel corrodes. Now, it might be a mil or 2 or 3 or 10 or 20, depending on the steel in the environment. Now, we're lucky at Hanford because the environment's not corrosive to soil. It's very dry. So the corrosion rate is small, but still it's a rate. Inside the tanks, it's a completely different thing. You have a mismatch of many, many radioactive materials and a lot of acids and a lot of bases. And it's not uniform, it's just a big mix. and it's a mess. So there's alkalines, there's acids, and it's in the tank, corroding through the tanks. All those tanks are going to eventually leak, every one of them. And that material is going to be in the soil. And it's a slow migration. It's only got to go about 80 feet down to the Valdo Stone until it gets to the groundwater, and then it's in the Columbia River. And as you pointed out, plutonium's half-life is 244,000 years. Half-life. It's going to happen. Not in my time, but it'll happen in our grandkids, grandkids. And then everybody will just throw their hands up because they all got it. And we know it right now. The second thing is a pushback that I do on you should build nuclear power plants. And I say yes, we need to build a lot of nuclear power plants, solve our energy problem. As soon as one person tells me what you do with the waste. One. 70 years ago, they built these plants. And I blame Roosevelt and Truman for not asking the question, what's the downside? What about the waste? Because the waste is there and it is not going to go away. So as soon as one of you three or someone else can tell me how you're going to manage the waste, then I'm for it. Until then, it's a no start. Now, I'm part of the group from Skagit Valley, Warm Bonds, these folks here. Most of us went on this tour, the B reactor tour. And the COVID did shut that down, but I think they're going to start up or have started up. I recommend everybody that's got the time to do a really good field trip to go to Hanford, go on a tour, and just ask these questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I just had just a couple comments about what you mentioned. The contents of those containers, one of the reasons why they're unable to vitrify them very easily is because each one of those containers has a different soup of crap, right? Radioactive crap, chemical waste, all kinds of stuff. So it makes it, they're not uniform, which makes it very, very hard to vitrify. And we've had all of these leaks, and unfortunately more will happen in your lifetime. One thing I like to say about the waste too, and we talk about this a lot, we had the argument is if we just designated Yucca Mountain as a repository for waste. Okay, let's hypothetically say that all these other things that we're talking about, all these potential problems are just non-existent. Let's just pretend that doesn't, there's not a connection to weapons, it's clean, they're safe, all of this. Let's just pretend that Yucca is then chosen. You still, and then let's say, okay, well, let's roll out 180 new reactors all over the country, which is sort of the plan for some of these boosters. You would still have to get that waste to Yucca Mountain. What does that mean? That means putting it on trains. It means putting it in trucks. It means cities like Bellingham, potentially, with a railroad that goes through town, could be carrying waste. This is the reality that we would be facing if we even believed all of the other bullshit. And that's a threat I think a lot of communities that would be along those routes would not be willing to take. Every other week it seems like we hear about another truck that overturned that had oil in it, or a derailment that went into the river, or not even to potentially talk about sabotage of something like this. The conversation about atomic energy as an answer really just, I almost want to pull my hair out sometimes, because it can be presented as a super technical answer and rationale, but very practically, I'm not a physicist, Ramana is. I'm not a physicist, but I can think about the potential, disasters that can happen. I mean, we're already experiencing disasters, and just, thinking that potentially they could be radioactive is just really, really mind-boggling, Climate change is creating an environment that's very unpredictable, that we're going to be experiencing these extremes. Now, throw a bunch of nuke plants in the mix, and you have all kinds of potential problems. This isn't even to talk about plants that are in war zones. I mean, we're dealing with Ukraine and Russia, and Zaporizhia, a plant that's in the war zone that has been taken offline many times, has a lot of potential for disaster. I mean, there are so many potential problems And nobody can predict the future. Nobody can tell you when the next conflict is going to break out. And, you know, it could be Taiwan. Taiwan has plants. Now they're going to be shutting those plants down, but they're going to have waste. Now, what if there is something breaks out there? I mean, the potential for catastrophe is enormous, and I think it should be alarming to all of us.
I had to write it down, so I'll forget what's been asked. But I was going to focus on children and youth. Kids are fierce, they have energy, and they are brainwashed by status quo. So, do you have recommendations or resources for young children to inspire them to become activists? And do you have action recommendations for youth that they can take now? Because they're angry and they're ready to do something. They just don't yet have power.
I'm sure others can add to this, but a great resource to look for education curriculum and resource lists for high school students and some elementary school students is Hibakusha Stories, which is an organization that's based in New York City, and it's an educational initiative. Part of their work has always been bringing hibakusha, which are atomic bomb survivors from Japan, into New York City high schools to talk to high school students, but they've also along the way developed videos and readings and lesson plans and different ways that you can talk to kids about nuclear weapons. I don't think they have as many resources on nuclear energy, but at least the weapons element is there for sure. And they also have speakers that can come out and work with other educators. They do like a educating educators program and things like that as well for teachers. So that's a great resource. And then I think in terms of actions, I mean, I've seen so much, I'm sure we've all seen so much fierce activism from students around gun violence and around climate change. And now this past year and a half as well on the genocide in Gaza and the student encampments at universities, but I know there was also walkouts in high schools and things like that. So I think partly it's about learning from the students about what actions they find to be effective, and I think from what I can see, it has been direct action, and I completely agree with them that that is where a lot more energy and effort is needed, and it's something that they can do, and it's a way to both express frustration and rage justifiably while making real meaningful change. So I think it's really looking to the student activists that are already out there doing this work and working with them around whether it's incorporating nuclear issues into their work or whether it's figuring out how what they're concerned about relates to other things that you're working on. Yeah. Do either of you perhaps?
I do know that Hanford Challenge down in Seattle does have a school outreach program. I don't know any details about it, but it's something you could look into.
Honesty. You know, we fucked up and we don't know how to do anything about it. And please figure it out is all I can say. And don't trust adults to tell you what to do.
Is that we need structural change of our society. And I've been thinking about that the last 20 minutes. We also want it to be peaceful, because I think most structural change in societies happens not in a peaceful manner. And which brought me to the point of why or how would you get there? And I do think that structural change will happen if there was a lot of power, meaning electrical power. And that it's shared, that it's not one country has the power and the other doesn't. So, what do you think about the nuclear fusion? Is that a feasible future?
Yes and no. Nuclear fusion, for those who don't know, is the other kind of nuclear energy, as it were, involving light nuclei coming together to form heavier nuclei and producing energy, as opposed to heavy nuclei splitting and producing energy, which is the nuclear fission energy that I talked about. Nuclear fusion is actually the source of most of our energy on the Earth. But that fusion happens, reactions happen in the sun. And when it happens there, it's fine. It works. Uh, on Earth, the first attempts at making nuclear fusion energy were in hydrogen bombs. And those things did produce nuclear fusion energy in an uncontrolled fashion. There is a lot of talk about trying to do nuclear fusion in a laboratory scale, and you know, every few years you will, or sometimes even every few months, you will hear about some breakthrough or the other. If you just count up all those breakthroughs, we should have been there long time ago, right? But there are three huge challenges to trying and using nuclear fusion, okay? So I'll give the example of the last major breakthrough in the United States, breakthrough within quotes, which happened at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in California in December 2022, if I remember right. Yeah, December 2022. When they used a bunch of laser beams to crush a small pellet and produce more energy than they put in. Okay? And that's what they claim, that we actually produce more energy than you put in. But there's some funny math there. Okay? So the amount of energy that's supposed to have gone inside that particular pellet was about 2 megajoules. Forget whatever, some unit it is, doesn't matter. Okay? And it's supposed to have produced about 3 megajoules, so a little, about 50% more than they put in. But what that leaves out is all of the energy that was used to energize those lasers. Those things together took about 400 megajoules. So you actually put in 400 of something and you got 3 of something. That doesn't sound like a particularly good equation to me. So that kind of and if you actually include all of the other energy that goes into creating that building and powering it and so on, you're using up an enormous amount of energy to just produce a tiny amount of energy. Okay, that's a physics problem, right? That's physically, if you don't produce more energy than you put in, you have a losing proposition. Okay, but let's say you can solve that. Okay, but this is something which is being done in a laboratory for a fraction of a microsecond. Okay, if you want to make a real electricity producing power plant, this has to be done 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Okay, this particular experiment, for them to reproduce it, do the same thing again, will take them roughly about a day before you can sort of set up everything, clean all the mess that's created, etc., etc. So that's not something which is workable at an engineering level. Okay, and there are a whole bunch of other engineering challenges having to do with what is the material that you require to be fused in, etc., etc. Okay, so there's a huge set of engineering challenges. And then even if you could solve all of those things, there's a third level of challenge, which is the economic challenge, right? How do we know that this is actually going to produce cheap enough energy? It's not a question of just producing energy. It's a question of producing energy that's cheap enough for us to use or for ordinary people to use. And there's absolutely no reason to think that fusion is going to produce cheap energy. And of course, it is going to have a whole bunch of other problems which we don't want to go into. So I don't have any hope that fusion is going to come along. It's certainly not going to be on any kind of time scale that is relevant to something like climate change. Okay. So I think it's actually a bad idea to be talking about fusion, because that allows us to think that somehow we can go along with how things are right now, and this magic technology is going to come and save us. It's not.
And I'll just add one last thing, is that the funding for fusion research in this country is done by the military. They're not doing it to produce energy. They're doing it to enhance weapons. And I think that alone, from anybody that's worried about proliferation, should be concerned with.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering if anyone all would speak to the extension of RECA and whether Hanford downwinders and similarly impacted communities qualify for that compensation.
Do you want to say what RECA is?
Sorry?
You want to say what RECA is?
Oh, RECA is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act.
What does it do?
It offers an opportunity for compensation for individuals who meet a threshold for impactedness by nuclear testing. Is that right? But it's only in some states, I believe.
Right. They're not. And the reason is that the federal government has never acknowledged that there's been intentional releases, which we know about, under the guise of testing. There was something called the Green Run, which they released this radioactive material into the air. The wind blew it. It got all over farmland, exposed farmers, and even though we know that this has happened, we don't know the extent of it, and the U.S. government hasn't really owned up to it, even though we have the documentation. We know it occurred. But this also just kind of talks about the bigger problem, is that it's really, really hard to look at the impacts of radioactive exposure because it can happen over time. It's cumulative, and it takes a lot of money to do this kind of epidemiological research. So we don't even today, I mean, we're still learning about the impacts from the Trinity test that happened and how that actually, contaminated farmland, which got into the milk, that got to the East Coast. I mean, there are so many things that we don't know, but unfortunately, no, there isn't anything really in place to compensate those impacted by Hanford. And again, I think that just gets back to this transparency issue.
Can I add, there's a book by Tricia Pritikin that she's an attorney, sick with cancer, representing a lot of people who have these horrible cancers. And if you read her book, that would give a lot of insight into your question. And it's basically the government just doesn't provide any information.
One thing I will say that I didn't talk about much is that Hanford, as you can imagine, is also one of the most dangerous places to work. And there are many, many instances where workers have been exposed to toxic chemical vapors that are coming out of tanks or other places. I mean, there's also was 55 or some crazy amount, millions and millions of gallons of chemical waste that was dumped directly into the soil. So there, like Hanford Reservation is like almost 500 square mile. It's huge. So all over the place, there's all these areas, and they continue to find new places where there's contamination or things. So there has been some worker compensation bills that have gone through the state legislature here in Washington to compensate those workers that get sick from their time working at Hanford, even if they're retired. So there are some things happening in that regard, which, it's a big step forward, even acknowledging that these workers are being exposed and working in these tremendously dangerous situations. I interviewed some workers that, when they were going through training, never even knew that this was a possibility. And they're watching these hour-long, hours and hours of safety videos, and they never learn about chemical vapors, even though they're working in these facilities. For years and years, workers were not given the right respiratory masks and things to work in these facilities, and they're coming out with horrible diseases, brain cancers, emphysema, things that were largely preventable in many ways. And this isn't to even mention, accidents that are happening out there all the time, which may pop up in the news now and then. It's a very dangerous place to work.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask if you can point us in the direction of any organizations that are doing effective work at anti-nuclear programs or divestment issues or anything like that, kind of, if you can give us some inspirational ideas of where to look for good ideas, anti-nuclear. Thank you.
So here in Washington, one of the groups I'm aware of is the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action, and they do a lot of work around the Bangor Naval Base that I talked about a bit. So they'd be, I think, in terms of local groups to check out, a good option, and others in this audience probably know others locally that are doing good work against either the base or Hanford or other things. In terms of work against nuclear weapons globally, there's the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. And that is made up of hundreds of organizations around the world, including here in the United States. And so if you just go to icanw.org, you can find the list of partners, and you can see locally if there's any groups that are involved in that. And so that as a coalition has worked for both the prohibition of nuclear weapons in international law, but also the elimination of nuclear weapons locally, where there's local organizations in nuclear armed states, and around the world. So that's in all regions of the world. So it's a good global community to be a part of. And ICANN has a divestment project called Don't Bank on the Bomb. So if you just go to don'tbankonthebomb.com, I believe is the address. They have a lot of information about banks that are investing in nuclear weapons, pension funds, different financial institutions, and they have really good instructions, shareable instructions for how to divest your own money if your bank is investing in nuclear weapons, or if your pension fund is, how to do advocacy with that institution to try and get them to divest, or where you can move your money to if you can't get your institution to divest, and different examples of city-based work as well to get cities to divest from nuclear weapons. So in New York City, for example, we actually got the city council, it took a few years, but we got the city council to adopt legislation to divest all of New York City's pension funds, so teachers, firefighters, et cetera, from nuclear weapon producing companies, the same way that many cities are trying to divest from the fossil fuel industry. So that they have some good examples of that type of work for folks on that website as well.
I'd like to add one. If you're talking local, well-funded, big group that's effective, Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility in Seattle, join that. Hanford Challenge, of course, would be a good alternate. But as far as local, a group that's been around for a long time, that's very effective, very active, with permanent staff, that's where I would go.
And I want to also add to that is Washington Against Nuclear Weapons, which Watkin Peace and Justice Center and our group No More Bombs are coalition members of, and so is Ground Zero, and they are working on all of these issues. They're going to have a conference in Seattle in April 11th and 12th. That's a Friday and Saturday, on nuclear weapons, and I left a few little pieces of information on the table out there about that. But Washington Against Nuclear Weapons is really a good organization. We're really lucky in Washington State to have it, and it is actually part of WPSR, Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility.
And I'll just add that Columbia Riverkeeper, which is actually based in Oregon, but works on a lot of these kind of issues, not so much weapons related, but there's been this big push in the Northwest for these small modular reactors and up and down the Columbia River, and they're a great resource for what's happening and how to get active with that as well, because those are actually going to be potentially sited on the Washington side. After the shutdown of Trojan, the plant in Oregon, they passed legislation or actually it was a bill, or a ballot measure that was signed into law, banning any new nuclear facilities in the state of Oregon until there was a permanent repository for waste, which we know there won't be. It was a brilliant ballot measure. Well, the companies that want to build these small modular reactors are like, well, that's fine. We'll just move over to Washington State. So, there may be some potential here to get something like that passed in this state as well, which I'd love to see happen.
This room should be full because this is such an issue. So do you have any comment on that? It's really hard. We try to do programs and bring people in, and I'm sure Washington Peace and Justice do the same. Many advocacy groups do. But how do you get people to think about this issue? Any suggestions?
For me, I try to find out what local folks are struggling with, and learn about that and connect how nuclear weapons or nuclear energy are related to that struggle. So I look at folks, or I try to work with folks who are working on the carceral systems, so police and prisons, and looking at the structural similarities between the corporate involvement in those industries and the method of profiteering, as well as the sort of systemic inequalities. I have talked to folks working on border issues, for example, and immigration enforcement, looking at theories of deterrence even, so how the border crossings are made more difficult under this policy of deterrence, and then people die as a result of this, and get people to think through structurally, myself included, of how that relates to the concept of nuclear deterrence and other concepts that are all about putting people at risk in order to protect people in a theoretical way, and the questions of who's being protected, who's being harmed, who's profiting, and who's being oppressed. And so, yeah, I just try and figure out the different ways that nuclear weapons are related to what people are interested in. So climate change, of course, is an obvious one, I think, for the discussion that we've had here today. But there's many ways that nuclear weapons theoretically or structurally, materially relate to other issues that people are really concerned about. And I think, especially in this moment with Gaza, like I was mentioning, sort of a good entry point has been talking to people that are doing divestment work or trying to get doing the student encampment work around boycotts as well, and looking at the companies that they're targeting, and many of them are the same producers of nuclear weapons. So whether it's Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, all those companies involved in genocide as well as the making of the bomb. So yeah, I think there's lots of different ways to do that, and that's sort of how I've been trying to bring more people in, is to not just do nuclear events, because a lot of people will see nuclear in the title and they'll think, that's not relevant to me. I'm worried about dying at school from gun violence, or I'm worried about climate change. And so, yeah, trying to advertise events or have conversations that bring people together that are working on different issues, and how we can all connect up in solidarity in our struggles.
We'll take one more question. Somebody has? Otherwise, I'll wrap up.
Well, I have a comment from a historical perspective. I go to Vegas once in a great while, and there's an old bar there called the Atomic Cafe, where people used to get up on top of the bar with a drink and watch the atomic testing blast off in the desert. And women became very upset all over the world because of all the atmospheric atomic testing of bombs by all the nuclear armed countries, that was stopped by women who discovered our breast milk has radioactivity in it. That happened, that was done. And I don't know, back in the 80s sometime, there was a huge movement called the Nuclear Freeze Movement, which the cities would say we're a nuclear free zone, things like that. And I think that was part of the decrease in the number of weapons that we have. So there is hope, and I'm surprised everybody else mentioned that the victims of the atomic bombs in Japan just this last time won the Nobel Peace Prize. These people were in their 90s. They're giving a speech about what they've gone through and all the work that they've done and are doing to protect us all. So there is hope, even though it may not always seem that way. Anyway, thank you for your work.
Yeah.